Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Virtual Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the director of the Hammer's public programs, and I want to welcome you all to tonight's program on race, identity, and alienation in the American novel, co-presented with the UCLA English Department. This program is part of a literary series called Some Favorite Writers, curated by novelist and UCLA professor of English, Mona Simpson. Mona and I were very enamored with novelist Yi-Yun Lee's Pandemic Book Club, where a lot of people read War and Peace together as they stayed home during the COVID shutdown. And we like the idea of revisiting one of the great American novels together as a group with all of you. So we selected Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and for the past 3 weeks, we've had a small, intimate book club rereading the book together. And now tonight, we have a great panel discussion for you to talk about the book, but also about its legacy in the form of other great, more recent works of American literature that also take us deep into issues of race, identity, and alienation. Books like Kathy Park Hong's Minor Feelings, Viet Thanh Nguyen's The Sympathizer, Colson Whitehead's The Intuitionist, or John Henry Days, or most recently, Danielle Evans' book, The Office of Historical Corrections. So tonight we'll talk about how Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man has a continuing relevance today, especially as we as a country are grappling with the tension between the founding principles of the United States and the failure to see them applied equitably to all our people. Before we start, I have just a quick note for the audience. Please note that this program is being recorded and will be available later on the Hammer website. This program is a Zoom webinar, so we can see your names and anything you type into the chat or the Q&A boxes, and we'd love for you all to introduce yourselves in the chat box, and feel free to talk with each other there. And the Q&A box is where you type in questions you have for our guest speakers. So now on to our program. Our moderator and host tonight is Mona Simpson, the author of 6 acclaimed novels and professor in the UCLA English Department. She's been awarded a Whiting Prize, a Guggenheim, a Hodder Fellowship from Princeton, and most recently, the Literature Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Recently, her short story, Wrong Object, originally published in Harper's Magazine, was included in the anthology of Best American Short Stories, and she has a new book coming out next spring, title TBD. Our first guest speaker is Adam Bradley. He is also a professor of English at UCLA, where he directs the Laboratory for Race and Popular Culture, also known as the Rap Lab. He's the author or editor of 6 books, one of which is Ellison's previously unpublished second novel, 3 Days Before the Shooting, which Bradley edited and published with Ralph Ellison's literary executor, John Callahan. Bradley also wrote the scholarly work, Ralph Ellison in Progress, From Invisible Man to 3 Days Before the Shooting, which draws on thousands of pages of Ralph Ellison's journals, typescripts, computer drafts, and handwritten notes to reassess Ellison's literary legacy. He's also the author of Book of Rhymes, The Poetics of Hip Hop, The Anthology of Rap, and the New York Times bestseller, One Day It'll All Make Sense, a memoir of the rapper and actor Common. His latest book is The Poetry of Pop. Danielle Evans is the author of the story collections, The Office of Historical Corrections, and Before You Suffocate Your Own Fool Self. Her first collection won the Pan American Bingham Prize, the Hearst Wright Award, and the Patterson Prize for Fiction. Her second was a finalist for the Aspen Prize, the Story Prize, and the LA Times Book Prize for Fiction. She's the 2021 winner of the New Literary Project Joyce Carol Oates Prize, a 2020 National Endowment for the Arts Fellow, and a 2011 National Book Foundation honoree. Her stories have appeared in magazines including the Paris Review, A Public Space, American Short Fiction, Callaloo, the Sewanee Review, and Phoebe, and have been anthologized in the Best American Short Stories 2008, 2010, 2017, and 2018, and in New Stories from the South. And she currently teaches writing in the writing seminars at Johns Hopkins University. So now please join me in welcoming Mona Simpson, Adam Bradley, and Danielle Evans. Welcome to the Hammer Museum.
Oops, excuse me. Thank you for all. Oops, sorry about that. I'm glad you're all here. It's been such a privilege and a pleasure to read this great novel over the course of the last month with many of you. And I'm especially grateful to my brilliant colleague, Adam Bradley, and to Danielle, the inventive and talented young writer. And I'm hoping we can start off our discussion tonight by Danielle reading from a climactic moment of the novel, though not the most climactic sort of triggering scene, but right after.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I know that some of you know this book very well, and some of you may not have read it in a while or are joining the conversation and haven't yet had the chance to read it. So I'm just going to do a brief introduction before I jump into this passage.
Thank you.
At this point, we are toward the end of the book. Our narrator has been affiliated with a supposedly progressive political organization called the Brotherhood. He was organizing in Harlem. They sent him downtown for a little bit, and he's returned to Harlem to find that the youth organizer, Brother Todd Clifton, has vanished from the organization. He comes across Clifton selling these dancing stereotypical Sambo dolls on the corner. They have a brief confrontation. As the narrator is walking away, he sees Clifton get into a physical altercation with a cop who shoves him. And then when Clifton kind of reacts to that, escalates, and Clifton is shot and killed in front of the narrator. And so this scene is a little bit after the immediate action, in which the narrator is kind of walking away and processing what he's just seen. Why did he choose to plunge into nothingness, into the void of faceless faces, of soundless voices lying outside history? I tried to step away and look at it from a distance of words read in books, half remembered. For history records the patterns of men's lives, they say, who slept with whom and with what results, who fought and who won, and who lived to lie about it afterwards. All things, it is said, are duly recorded, all things of importance, that is. But not quite, for actually it is only the known, the seen, the heard, and only those events that the recorder regards as important that are put down, those lies his keepers keep their power by. But the cop would be Clifton's historian, his judge, his witness, and his executioner, and I was the only brother in the watching crowd. And I, the only witness for the defense, knew neither the extent of his guilt nor the nature of his crime. Where were the historians today, and how would they put it down? I stood there with trains plunging in and out, throwing blue sparks. What did they ever think of us transitory ones? Ones such as I had been before I found brotherhood. Birds of passage who were too obscure for learned classification, too silent for the most sensitive recorders of sound, of natures too ambiguous for the most ambiguous words, and too distant from the centers of historical decision to sign or even to applaud the signers of historical documents. We who write no novels, histories, or other books, what about us, I thought, seeing Clifton again in my mind and going to sit upon a bench as a cool gust of air rolled up in the tunnel. A body of people came down the platform, some of them Negroes. Yes, I thought, what about those of us who shoot up from the south into the busy city, like wild jacks in the box, broken loose from our springs, so sudden that our gait becomes like that of deep sea divers suffering from the bends? What about those fellows waiting still and silent there on the platform, so still and silent that they clash with the crowd in their very immobility, standing noisy in their very silence, harsh as a cry of terror in their quietness? What about those three boys coming now along the platform, tall and slender, walking stiffly with swinging shoulders in their well-pressed, too hot for summer suits, their collars high and tight about their necks, their identical hats of black cheap felt set upon the crowns of their heads with a severe formality above their hard conked hair? It was as though I'd never seen their like before, walking slowly, their shoulders swaying, their legs swinging from their hips, in trousers that ballooned upward from cuffs fitting snug about their ankles, their coats long and hip-tight with shoulders far too broad to be those of natural Western men. These fellows whose bodies seemed, what had one of my teachers said of me? You're like one of those African sculptures, distorted in the interest of a design. Well, what design and whose? I stared as they seemed to move like dancers in some kind of funeral ceremony, swaying, going forward, their black faces secret, moving slowly down the subway platform, the heavy heel-plated shoes making a rhythmical tapping as they moved. Everyone must have seen them, or heard their muted laughter, or smelled the heavy pomade on their hair, or perhaps failed to see them at all. For they were men outside of historical time. They were untouched. They didn't believe in brotherhood, no doubt it had never heard of it, or perhaps like Clifton would mysteriously have rejected its mysteries, men of transition whose faces were immobile. I got up and went behind them. Women shoppers with bundles and impatient men in straw hats and seersucker suits stood along the platform as they passed. And suddenly I found myself thinking, do they come to bury the others or be entombed, to give life or to receive it? Do the others see them, think about them, even though standing close enough to speak? And if they spoke back, would the impatient businessmen in conventional suits and tired housewives with their plunder understand? What would they say? For the boys speak a jived up transitional language, full of country glamour, think transitional thoughts, though perhaps they dream the same old ancient dreams. They were men out of time, unless they found brotherhood. men out of time who would soon be gone and forgotten. But who knew, and now I begin to tremble so violently I had to lean against a refuse can. Who knew but that they were the saviors, the true leaders, the bearers of something precious, the stewards of something uncomfortable, burdensome, which they hated because living outside the realm of history, there was no one to applaud their value and they themselves failed to understand it. What if Brother Jack were wrong? What if history was a gambler instead of a force in a laboratory experiment, and the boy is his ace in the hole? What if history was not a reasonable citizen, but a madman full of paranoid guile, and these boys his agents, his big surprise, his own revenge? But they were outside in the dark with Sambo, the dancing paper doll, taking it on a Lambo with my fallen brother, Todd Clifton, Todd, running and dodging the forces of history instead of making a dominating stand.
Thank you.
And that passage is so striking. And Mona, I wonder if you could indulge me to make a connection.
Please.
To it. It's this idea of those transitory ones that Danielle's reading about, those outside of historical time. These were people that Ellison wanted to write for and about. When he talks about speaking for you, he was also thinking about these young men, these people who write no novels, he says, those of us who shoot up from the South. He's thinking about the Great Migration, where the majority of Black Americans moved from the rural South to the urban North. He's thinking about those people who were not the subject of novels oftentimes, and that Ellison consciously wanted to make so. 11 years before the publication of Invisible Man, he wrote a letter to Richard Wright after Wright published a book called 12 Million Black Voices, 1941. It's a photo essay about the Great Migration. And Ellison writes the following. I'll just read just a brief passage from the letter. He writes, "Back when I first knew you, remember, I often speculated as to what it was that made the difference between us and the others who shot up from the same region. Well, now, and it is this which makes us brothers," he writes, "I think it is because this past which filters through your book has always been tender and alive and aching within us. We are the ones who had no comforting amnesia of childhood and for whom the trauma of passing from the country to the city of destruction brought no anesthesia of unconsciousness, but left our nerves peeled and quivering. We are not the numbed, but the seething. God, it makes you want to write and write and write or murder." And I remember reading this passage in the Library of Congress, holding the page where he had revised this letter multiple times before sending it off to Richard Wright, his slightly older friend and certainly someone who was more established at that stage than Ellison had ever hoped to be, having already published Native Son. And it just struck me as he was holding on to these ideas that he then finds a way to give voice to in these three young Zoot Suiters, and this beautiful passage that Danielle just read so powerfully. And I just wanted to just share that connection to show the continuity of thought that Ellison was holding on to these ideas for so long.
And everywhere here, this novel written mid-century, set in the 30s, that's sort of asking the question of history, of what will finally record this injustice, what will finally show this. And it's one of those moments in the book that's startling to think how relevant it was today. It is today. And there's sort of several layers, because there's also, in many ways, Clifford was really a friend to Invisible Man. And so there's the personal dimension of losing Clifford, and then there's the sense of how is this noticed by the world, and he then takes on his funeral. How did it? I mean, that's kind of amazing when you think of it. Not many books from that long ago would have an incident that could just be lifted to today. And I wanted to read just a tiny little bit. So here we have an incident, a cop shooting a kid who's a street peddler, a former member of the Brotherhood. we have that, which could just as well be a scene in the 21st century captured on a cell phone. The cell phone camera, which might be our contemporary historian. But the book also reaches back to the 19th century as well. This is a scene where Invisible Man is just barely becoming politicized in a new way. He's just moved up to the north, and he's walking outside, and he sees a crowd of people very upset because an old couple is being evicted from their apartment. And all their things have been brought out onto the street. And I'll just read this little bit. I turned away, bending and searching the dirty snow for anything missed by my eyes, and my fingers closed upon something resting in a frozen footstep, a fragile paper coming apart with age, written in black ink grown yellow. I read, "Free papers. Be it known to all men that my Negro, Primus Provo, has been freed by me this day, the 6th of August, 1859, signed John Samuels Macon." I folded it quickly, blotting out the single drop of melted snow which glistened on the yellow page, and dropped it back into the drawer. My hands were trembling, my breath rasping as if I had run a long distance or come upon a coiled snake in a busy street. It has been longer than that, farther removed in time, I told myself, and yet I knew that it hadn't been. I replaced the door in the chest and pushed drunkenly to the curb. But it wouldn't come up. Only a bitter spurt of gall filled my mouth and splattered the old folks' possession. I turned and stared again at the jungle, no longer looking at what was before my eyes, but inwardly, outwardly, around a corner into the dark, far away and long ago, not so much of my own memory as of remembered words, of linked verbal echoes, images, heard even when not listening at home. So there are many ways in which this novel is both, it's so capacious because it goes back in time to slavery. There's a character who actually was a slave, and forward, echoing scenes we see in the 21st century. And in many ways, as a stylist, Ellison is also using tropes of the 19th century big Dickensian novel, and as well as tropes of modernism, which is part of, I think, what makes its brilliance and the reason it lasts so much. I wonder what you thought about that, each of you.
One of the things that's so interesting to me about this section is that he is increasingly becoming literally weighed down by history, right? He keeps collecting these objects. So he sort of enters this section with the smashed remains of his former landlord, who's a Black woman, has a Jolly Negro bank that's a very racist caricature bank that he gets so angry he smashes, but then he's too embarrassed to tell her he smashed it. So he's carrying it around. And then the character who was formerly a slave has this sort of chain. I'm describing it badly, but there's like an iron that he's literally carrying, an iron that this man handed him. And then the Sambo doll. And so he keeps his briefcase is full of this literally weighted symbolism. And I think a slightly lesser writer could not have pulled off that kind of metaphor, but it somehow works because he keeps forgetting he's carrying all this baggage. And then he's like, why is this bag so heavy? And toward the end of the book kind of opens it up and all of that history is there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, discarding those elements is an essential part of the ritual of his passage into losing illusion and a kind of awakening. Ellison, and we talked about this in some of the book club sessions, Ellison was fascinated with dilating the space of realism to account for these moments of absurdity in lived experience for Black Americans under segregation. And with something like that heavily freighted symbolism that literally, as Danielle said, is weighing him down.
Yeah.
Part of the reason he can pull that off is because we have the battle royal scene with an electrified carpet, because we have the hospital machine that performs a lobotomy, because we have all of these things that stretch the frame of what the novel can contain.
And because he's such an indelible voice that can manage to contain all those extremities. We're not always completely, he's finding himself. He's vacillating wildly. So his voice grows as the novel grows. He starts out very proper, sort of a proponent of respectability politics, and he's going to do everything the right way, and little by little his consciousness is changed to the point at the very ending. I mean, there's a photograph of someone who recreated, all the bulbs that Invisible Man was living among in that siphoned electricity, and it's a surreal picture, that was made from this essentially majority realist novel, but as you say, that pushes the envelope, Adam.
I mean, that leads really beautifully, I think, to the epilogue, which is so voice driven. This is where
most
we need to
beautiful
understand.
last line in, if Moby Dick has the most beautiful first line, this has the most beautiful last line.
Well, if you don't mind, I was thinking about reading to that.
Please do.
All right, this will be my section. It's a little longer than Mona's, but not too long. In going underground, I whipped it all except the mind. And the mind that had conceived a plan of living must never lose sight of the chaos against which that pattern was conceived. That goes for societies as well as for individuals. Thus, having tried to give pattern to the chaos which lives within the pattern of your certainties, I must come out. I must emerge. And there's still a conflict within me. With Louis Armstrong, one half of me says, open the window and let the foul air out, while the other says, it was good green corn before the harvest. Of course, Louis was kidding. He wouldn't have thrown old bad air out because it would have broken up the music and the dance, when it was the good music that came from the bell of old bad air's horn that counted. Old bad air is still around with his music and his dancing and his diversity, and I'll be up and around with mine. And as I said before, a decision has been made. I'm shaking off the old skin and I'll leave it here in the hole. I'm coming out, no less invisible without it, but coming out nevertheless. And I suppose it's damn well time. Even hibernations can be overdone, come to think of it. Perhaps that's my greatest social crime. I've overstayed my hibernation, since there's possibility that even an invisible man has a socially responsible role to play. Ah, I can hear you say. So it was all a build-up to bore us with his buggy jiving. He only wanted us to listen to him rave, but only partially true. Being invisible and without substance, a disembodied voice, as it were, what else could I do? What else but try to tell you what was really happening when your eyes were looking through? And it is this which frightens me. Who knows but that on the lower frequencies, I speak for you. And that last line resonates so powerfully. And if you go back to the drafts, I know Danielle and Mona, as novelists, you'll appreciate this. He troubled over that line so many times.
Really? What were some of the other choices?
So there are earlier versions where he simply writes, who knows but that I speak for you.
Oh,
and
not
then
half the musicality.
Yeah, and then he adds the lower frequencies,
which is kind of everything.
Yeah, only to cross it out and then put it back in. The penultimate draft has him with a pencil emendation of the lower frequencies crossed out, and then somehow it gets back in. And then he adds, and it is this which frightens me. And I remember reading this, as I see in the comments, some folks did in high school or college. I read mine first year of college, and I remember kind of understanding the question, even understanding the lower frequencies, which is often puzzling to folks, but I didn't understand the frightening element. What is it that frightens him? It's taken me years to come to my own understanding of that. And it's,
what is your understanding of it, Adam?
Well, to me, it's the idea that here we have in Ralph Ellison, a young Black man writing before Brown v. Board in the heat of segregation, creating a young Black character who has the audacity to end his memoir, Ellison's novel, with this line and this bold claim that he might in fact be able to speak for you, no matter who you may be, no matter what your race or identity, no matter where you live, no matter how old or how powerful, how rich you may be, that I can speak for you. And that's a scary thing, because it means taking on the responsibility both for yourself as a speaker and for others as well. That's maybe the biggest burden of all, is embracing the responsibility of representation and leadership.
And claiming a universality.
Yes, yes. Universality from the dogged particulars of a Black experience, which is often denied to writers before, who would read Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Watching God and say, well, this can only be about a Black community down here in Eatonville, Florida. This can only be about that. It cannot be universal. Right. Ellison took it as a given that he could write something that had universal reach from the particulars of his experience and that of his characters.
So much of this book is about the tension between wanting to be seen as an individual and understanding yourself as a member of a community, whether it's a racial community or a national community. So I do think that part of that terror is also the way in which even the parts of Blackness or the parts of America that offend or terrify him belong to him enough that he can speak for them, right? I think that some of the ambiguity in that final line is not just the terror of making the claim, but the terror of knowing you know something well enough for it to be inextricable from you, right? For all of the things that he's tried to run from or distance himself from, sort of understanding that all of these identities are his, and he'll never outrun them, is also kind of terrifying. And also sort of, what has this country done to you to make you be able to hear so many voices, even the ones that despise you so clearly?
So beautiful. And I mean, there's a passage earlier in the epilogue when he talks about affirming the principle, the principles of democracy and the founding of the United States, and also the people with it, and the people most of all, and that his community as a Black person speaking for and representing in this way, finally being a leader that he wanted to be in the very beginning, that it was contingent upon us most of all, he says, and I'm quoting badly here, but because we had suffered the most, because we knew what it really was, what the cost of freedom really is, in a way that those who hadn't suffered in a particular way did not, that we knew the cost of that kind of freedom. And yeah, I think there is an element of that certainly resonating in the final line.
There's a question that seems particularly apt in the question and answer box, which is, what is meant by the lower frequencies? What is that explanation? Was it that explanation of the universality that you explained? But what exactly do you each think he means by the lower frequencies? I thought he meant, sort of, I thought, to me, it was sort of, in the most basic popular way, not in a vernacular everyone can have access to it way, not in a high art way. I guess that's what I thought it meant to me.
Yeah, I mean, two things come to mind. One, that Ellison, among his many gifts, he was a photographer and a sculptor for a time and a trumpet player. He also loved high fidelity audio equipment and in fact published articles under a pseudonym in these high fidelity magazines.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, so I think the frequencies, as in radio frequencies and sonic frequencies, were on his mind. I think most powerfully, though, the clarity came to me in seeing an inscription that Ellison put into John Callahan, his friend and person who would become a literary executor, into John Callahan's copy of Invisible Man. And he writes to John on the higher frequencies.
Oh.
On the things that connect us through the particulars of shared experience that are like not so much the commonalities of what make us all human, but the things that make us distinct as brothers in this case, as people who shared the same bottle of spirits, as John talked about when he was in the session last week, who've had that Irish whiskey on Riverside Drive together. Those sorts of things that connect us in the intimate shared experiences. So yeah, I think you have it just right to my reading, Mona, that lower frequencies are those baseline elements of human connection that cross all differences.
Yeah, I like that. That makes a lot of sense. And I liked what you said, Danielle, too, about the tension throughout this novel about sort of being representational of a group, of his past, of any, of the many particular groups, but particularly of the history of Black Americans, being, he both wants to be, and I think we all feel that as writers, as people, as anything, do we want to be members of the various categories we're in, or do we want to also be something else? And there's that tension throughout, I think. He seems to try to elude the community more and realize his deep connection to it as the book goes on.
Yeah, I find it interesting that, part of what, this is one of the sections where we most see him, rather than kind of taking the identities that are projected onto him and accepting them, trying to put on various disguises, they all kind of fail, right? It doesn't work for him to try to be other people in the way, at least never in the way that he anticipates. But it's the first time we see him trying to get one step ahead of how people see him and lean into that invisibility, and it still doesn't work, right? And so we end up back at the beginning where he can only be himself, but with the knowledge of the ways in which he can sort of play with this invisibility. And so there's something kind of complicated about a sense of identity in this section where he's like, okay, well, if I'm invisible, then I'm invisible, then I'm going to make it work for me. And he can't. But it's sort of fascinating that after spending so much of the book kind of unintentionally or intentionally accepting assignments, you see him trying to manipulate or calculate here and trying to sort of imagine how he's going to be seen and kind of play that in some way that keeps getting out of his hands.
My student, Woody Brown, writes, as a disabled person, I know all about being an invisible man. I include myself in those lower frequencies. And we've had a number of people in the chat who have cited their own experiences of invisibility in America for various reasons, which is interesting.
I do in this section in particular, and I think it's a complicated question, but I wrestle with this, with what we would today read in terms of intersectionality, right? The way that gender and disability in particular play a role in this book, the way that, blindness is this operative metaphor, and so it becomes sometimes a kind of easy way of saying, oh, this person can't see, right? Like Jack's glass eye becomes sort of part of his monstrousness as opposed to just a sort of fact about him. I don't quite know what to do with Sybil. Like, as many times as I've read this book, I think there's something really brilliant happening in the way that, she's a representation of a particular kind of person, and she's not as much of a character as she could be, right? I think there's something complicated and vulnerable that Ellison manages to get on the page about her. At the same time, I do think, when we see the narrator get sent downtown to deal with the woman question, part of it is, there's something smart about the way that it's a joke to the organization, so it's kind of played as a joke, so we don't even know what he's saying, like in these speeches that he keeps giving, whereas we see bits and pieces of the other speeches even when they're not necessarily making sense. Like, it's not kind of the book's time because it's not a real assignment, and Ellison understands that. At the same time, there is a sort of way in which the unseriousness of the question to the brotherhood never becomes an entirely serious question to the book. So I do wonder about those other kinds of invisibility, not that it's one book's job to address all of them, but I think I wrestle with that a little bit.
Well, I think the question of women, and even more than the women question, or in addition to the women's question, which you're right to point out that he never does make any speech to them. We never see that, whereas we see his other speeches and see their development. The female characters are not as dense or powerful or felt, at least to me, in the book.
Yeah, Claudia, the great critic Claudia Tate, grapples with this decades ago in an essay she wrote on the invisible women in the novel. And it's definitely something that is striking in the book. One of the ways that I come to it is from the archive to see Ellison's compositional process and the revision, and particularly what he leaves out, what he leaves on the cutting room floor. And what he leaves on the cutting room floor, among other things, are a host of characters, including several more prominent women characters. Mary Rambo has a much more robust
That's
role
interesting.
in the book. Yeah, and he publishes a section of the expanded boarding house scene with Mary as the center at some point after the novel's publication. But there's even more in the drafts. There's also
How
a
did he
character.
decide to cut that? What do you think was his thinking?
Well, I think that he increasingly came to understand that this was a novel, as you said so powerfully, Mona, about voice and one voice. That the characters needed to be in service of that voice, the tertiary characters, and so all the secondary characters become foreshortened and flattened, I would say, regardless of their race or identity or gender or whatever the case may be. There is no robust character. The only one that comes kind of close is Clifton, I would say.
Kind of Clifton.
Yeah, kind of, but only in as much as we see him through Ellison's protagonist's eyes. And we see him as being, in fact, greater and more substantial than he is on the page. But yeah, I mean, there are a couple quick other additions to women characters that get cut out, the most central of which is a character by the name of Louise. And there's a beautiful passage from the prologue where Invisible Man explains how he ends up underground in the coal cellar. He said, "As I was running in the night from Roz, the destroyer." Well, there's an original draft that says, "When I was running in the night from Louise." Now that was a woman of women. And it turns out this Louise was a white member of the Brotherhood, and that in certain episodes that he had written and not published, and in certain notes that he had taken for the book, in imagined possibilities, these kind of cul-de-sacs of composition, he imagined Invisible Man marrying her. He imagined them having an extensive love affair. He imagined the book being in part about love. And he cuts all that out in the service of the voice, for better, for worse.
Yeah, the sexuality in the book and the whole love plot is very submerged. There's really very little. But
interested. I'm thinking about, Adam, the way that you talked about the role of the Great Migration in this book. I taught one of my favorite novels ever, jazz, this semester, which is, even when I'm teaching, not teaching jazz, but teaching anything about the Great Migration, I tend to read those passages to my students because I think they somehow capture something about that movement and disruption better than other things that I hadn't thought to put these passages in conversation. But I think there's something, that passage in jazz about the city is about falling in love with the city, and yet love is a very ambiguous force in that book. And I think there's something about this book that is also a love letter to the city, all of the ambiguous and terrible capacity of love too.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Those descriptions of Harlem are, almost unsurpassed in terms of loving a city and falling and the romance of the city and of its opportunity, and of the way he sees the opportunities at first with these crazy letters to these trustees, and then the way he later sees these opportunities with the Brotherhood and with his own capacities to organize people, change Harlem for the better. No, it's really interesting.
Ellison has a long unpublished essay called Adventures of an Unintentional New Yorker, which is his more memoir-driven love letter to New York City and to Harlem in particular. And it's striking to read that beside some of these early passages of arriving in Harlem, and also to read it beside another large unpublished section that one can find in the Library of Congress, which is a curio of sorts in the archive, a memoir fragmentary that he wrote of in the second person, which is striking. You do this, you do that, you travel on the train down to Tuskegee in Alabama, and this and that and the other thing. But the energy of that, I mean, it gets tiresome to read it in the second person after a while, but nonetheless, the gesture toward inviting a reader in that way and commanding that they see themselves in his experience as he encounters New York City for the first time, striking to my reading.
How do you think the novel would be? Do you teach it often? I found my students absolutely, those who hadn't read it before, were absolutely mesmerized and riveted.
Do you teach it, Danielle? I get scared too. In some,
Really?
I'll talk it in
Yeah,
a
'cause it's
minute,
full of
partly because I
complexity.
feel like they need to have seen it the second time, and I don't like. I want to be the person who teaches it the second time, and I can never
That's
tell if they've been
funny.
assigned it once. And I say
That's
that
funny.
lovingly. Like I mean, I have this. You can't see my this copy I've had since like 1997 of Invisible Man. And so I
Wow.
have all of these years of notes in it. And my first set of notes from when I read it in high school are ridiculous. Like I don't think I understood any. I mean, I love the book, but I don't think I understood a single thing that happened. I don't know why I underlined half the things I underlined. There are margin notes that are like just like I'm trying to describe what happened, but it's not what happened. And I do think it's a book that, because it's so seductive, right? Because it has that great voice, it's easy to think that you understand it because you're with it. It's like listening to a person's story. But then if somebody asks you, like, you know, it's like sitting in a bar with somebody and hearing them tell their life story. But if someone quizzed you on it afterwards, you would not remember any of the details, or you'd be like adding your own thing. And so I think that it takes, I don't know, for me at least, it takes 2 reads, and it also takes a lot of historical context. I think I haven't taught it in years. I used to teach an African American literature survey course, and in that class, I think you have to teach this book because so much of later literature is directly or indirectly responsive, or just answering the same questions, even if it's not specifically engaging this text. I mean, there's a way in which so many of its questions are recurrent questions of African American literature. So, but I think that it requires kind of teaching some of the references so they can see that it's not just somebody kind of talking to talk, that like is actually engaging these various historical figures, these historical movements, and these sort of various solutions to the race problem that you could miss if you didn't know that. And it also takes time. I mean, I think you need at least 3 weeks, and usually I don't have 3 weeks in a semester.
We've taken 4. We've taken 4.
So I almost taught it last semester. I taught a passing class, and I was trying, even though this is not really a passing novel, it seemed relevant enough but I couldn't find the time to do it justice and still teach things I had to teach in a passing course. So I couldn't squeeze it in, but someday we'll get there.
Well, fortunately for all of us, Danielle, in terms of the historical references and everything, Adam is publishing next year, is it? You're going to do the annotated Invisible Man. So we'll all be able to teach that, which will be.
Where were you when I was teaching the F-Hamlet survey
I know.
course? We needed you.
Oh, I know, and it's been the progress on that has been delayed a bit as our world has been delayed a bit by COVID. But I can't wait to have this in the world. And I consulted so many high school teachers and students to get a sense of how they were teaching the book, what they were avoiding about it, the kinds of questions that students had in the junior, senior years when they're reading this. And all that is applicable too at the college level. It's striking. One last thing, Mona, I'm teaching it next spring, so we'll see. I'm doing an Ellison course, a single author.
Oh, great!
So I'll be.
I love doing that. And one of the things I wanted to say about this novel is it's rare to have a voice-driven novel, a 21st century or even a 20th century voice-driven novel that's this long and this ambitious and this capacious. We saw it with Melville, we saw it with Dickens, we saw it, but most novels that are this long are more balanced and Tolstoyan and George Eliot in their derivation. And I found it such a pleasure to be so in this voice for so long and have such a complete experience. Somebody in the chat, I see there's a question too, but somebody says that Amy says she'd like to hear more about the fear of teaching the novel. She finds that as an art historian, she also finds herself coming up against the effort to teach historical early 20th century, late 19th century material in the visual arts. But then there are aspects of imagery language that are overtly racist, white supremacist, including when I integrate visual analysis, she says, with literary works of the same moment. So that's interesting, I think. I think fear is unfortunately kind of a relevant emotion in teaching at our particular moment. You know, we talked tonight about what passage we would read and would it be triggering, and you know, we become more sensitive, which I think for the most part is a good thing, but it does include some fear.
Yeah, I mean, I think that at this point, I just try to be as direct as possible. And so I don't give trigger warnings per se, because I don't know exactly
What's a trigger?
going to be trigger. You know, like, and I say that at the beginning of the semester, like, it's not that I don't care about you, it's that people respond to things differently. And there's also a way in which triggering discourse can be silencing, because some people want to talk about things. And especially I teach a lot of creative writing courses. In a creative writing course, sort of something like assigning a trigger warning to sexual assault can also have an effect on people who want to write about their own experiences. So there's a balancing act, and I just try to be as clear as possible about on the first day of class, saying like, I'm working to make this as sort of honest and careful a space, and not, I want this to be a sort of space in which we take care of each other, but also a space in which we understand that sort of at some point you may have to protect yourself from a particular conversation. I think partly for me, it's less fear and more time, because I do think when I taught the survey course, I would say, okay, today's lecture is going to contain some really difficult material, or today's lecture is going to contain some really offensive imagery, because I want you to see what people are responding to. I mean, I sort of start with early American literature, and so in order to teach like Walker's Appeal, I have to read Jefferson's Notes from the State of Virginia, which are horrifying, right? And I think horrifying goes to here, and also horrifying because I think some people, maybe not at this point, but I think 10 years ago when I last taught the survey, were still kind of coming in with certain illusions about our country's founding fathers, that like it was hard for them to hear both the content and also hard for them to hear from somebody they had been taught to esteem, right? So I think that partly it's just stage setting. So like when I taught Invisible Man, I showed the sort of Jolly Negro bank so that they could sort of see the idea of what this person was carrying. I think that there are I think we listened to some audio of Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey speaking, because it felt like, you know, there's sort of these shadow figures in the book, that it was important for the students to have some sense of like how these people commanded the audience they commanded. And also to sort of have some sense of like what the discourse the book was responding to was. I think that it was sort of a richer discussion for that. But I think it does take a lot of time, and it's time that in a better educational system, I could count on my students coming to my literature class with that history, and I wouldn't have to spend half of my time that I want to spend talking about sentences doing some kind of basic US history.
Yeah.
But I cannot count on that, and I think I still can't count on that.
Well, one of the pleasures of UCLA and the quarter system is we sometimes do what you're doing, Adam, next spring, which is we can take a book and spend 10 weeks on it, which is really what a book like this deserves and can use. I mean, to tease out all the complexities and have the conversations. In fact, some of the triggering conversations that this book does provoke, which is what we want from books in many ways.
I think that's it. Yeah, and I was going to add to that, Mona, that and you know, to Danielle's wonderful comment as well on teaching the book, that this book is supposed to provoke you.
Yeah,
it's meant to do that. So we don't want to silence what Ellison was up to in creating these occasions for provocation. What we do have to be mindful of as teachers, of course, those of us who are teaching the book in our classrooms, is when and where we enter the discourse, when and where our students find their places into it as well, and to create an atmosphere that's conducive to difficult conversations. And that, as Danielle said, is hard work. It's heavy lifting. And you know, all of us, regardless of our personal identities, have a way of being able to teach a work like this. Ellison, of all authors that I can think of, would want this book to be read widely. He understood himself as writing in the context of world literature, not in a narrow parochial context only of African-American literature. So I think because of that, this book demands that attention. It also demands, particularly in a moment like this, when the vulnerabilities of certain populations are on display, that we discuss it with an awareness of the context and with an atmosphere that creates the possibility for deference to people's really personal and direct connection to the issues at hand.
Mm-hmm. There's a question from Larry, and they say that this is my first time reading Invisible Man, and I'm indeed in love with it. Do you have suggestions for further reading, similar reads? That's a hard question, but I can throw in a few. I really do think if you love this book, you will love Moby Dick and David Copperfield. And I also love, I mean, almost everything. Yes, Office of Historical Corrections, for sure. Many books by Toni Morrison, and almost everything by Edward P. Jones, I think, are some of my favorites.
I think jazz, as I already mentioned, I think because it has this sort of wonderful echo of the Great Migration. I often teach jazz alongside Mrs. Dalloway, which is also, I think, a really beautiful book about
Beautiful book.
Individual, like how you're experiencing a world and also experiencing an individual life at the same time, experience a kind of historical moment and a self. Colson Whitehead's John Henry Days, I think, is a more contemporary kind of kaleidoscopic movement through US history through the lens of race that I really love. And there's something on the tip of my tongue, but Adam, you look like you were gonna jump.
How about you, Adam?
Yeah, I was going to say that I read a book that just came out that I think resonates with some of the voice-driven elements and also the dilated realism, that kind of expanding the frame as Ellison does of what is the real in Sunjana Satyan's The Gold Diggers, which just came out earlier this year. And it's from a South Asian immigrant experience based in Atlanta. And the story is told through the first person perspective of a young man who's grappling with the weight of the model minority myth and finding his space through it. And it's just a remarkable and delightful book that's driven by that voice and by his retrospective glance on his experience and his coming to a awareness of how he fits in the world. So yeah, that's definitely one book that is recent that came to mind in relation to Invisible Man.
I forgot to unmute myself. Someone just put The Sympathizer in the chat, which is one of those books that's sort of in direct conversation in a really interesting way with Invisible Man.
And White Boy Shuffle by
Maurice
Paul
Ruffin's We Cast No Shadow is also kind of really directly engaging Ellison in an interesting way.
I would also put in a plug for Ayanna Mathis, who's a very talented young writer. And somebody mentions L'étranger by Camus, which does, you could see little echoes of that, but it's a very different kind. That's what an example of that, of the kind of voice driven but very, very brief book. Someone else mentions Ocean Vuong.
And going back to the older catalog of books, Ellison would have claimed, and quite literally did claim, Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground as a source. In fact, I found in the archive a place where he had written the opening paragraph of Dostoevsky's book and the opening paragraph of Invisible Man side by side, using his computer in the 80s and printing it out in this dot matrix page with the lines, little strips of paper running on both sides with the holes in it. I mean, it was wonderful to see his conscious awareness of finding that voice and crafting it based upon found materials in that way.
Any final thoughts or questions from the experience of reading this book again? It's also, Nabokov says that any real reader is a rereader, and I'm a devotee, I'm a believer in that. But it is really an interesting experience, as you mentioned, Danielle, to look at your comments the first time through and find the layers that you come to later. And of course, Adam, you've studied this book and studied the archives. I'd love to hear what your experience was this time of reading the book, each of you.
It's funny because I think part of, I remember reading it the first time and understanding it as almost a completely surreal book, and then rereading it years later, and not that because it's playing with the boundaries of realism as Adam talked about so beautifully, but so much more is just real and absurd than I remembered. I sort of had this idea that it was happening in some kind of almost different world when I read it as a teenager. And by the time I read it again, even in college, I sort of recognized the world more clearly. And it was like, no, this is just a kind of absurdity that feels surreal because you have to live through it. And I think every time I read it, it feels a little bit more realistic. I don't know if I'm just getting older, if the world is actually seeming more absurd to me than it used to. But I think I find fewer and fewer places where I feel like I'm in that sort of dream state, and more places where I just sort of take the book on faith and say like, yeah, that could happen. Sure, I believe it.
That makes a lot of sense. How about you, Adam?
Gosh, I love that last point, Danielle. I mean, I just made the trip just a matter of months ago from spending 10 years in Boulder, Colorado, to being now at UCLA. And the crazy thing was that I still haven't, because of COVID, unpacked most of my boxes. So I have a copy that I've been reading for the better part of a quarter century, over and over, almost usually multiple times a year. Instead, I went through it on Kindle this time. And so that in itself was an experience, because I didn't have the layers, the kind of palimpsest that Danielle's talking about, of seeing the layers of one's multiple readings over the span of time and one's growth as a reader. And in that regard, it was a wonderful, fresh experience of coming to the novel for the first time, of the familiar now being unfamiliar, because my notes weren't there to guide me in my thinking. And I came up with some things that surprised me. And it's wonderful to be able to say that about a book you've read 40, 50 times in your life.
Of course,
in fairness, some of my margin notes are just like this drawing of a face and a heart. Like they're not all
I love
particularly instructive or illuminating.
Oh, but no, that's how we read. That's how we read books. Our lives are tangled in them, But we know more now too than we did. I mean, as a culture, than the first time I read this book. We know about the medical experimentation, all that sort of thing, I mean, I had exactly the same. You articulated it so well, Danielle, but the first time I read it too, it seemed like a much more fantastical, surreal novel. And this time it seemed to me almost completely realism. There was hardly any part I couldn't see as possibly real.
Ellison, when he was asked 4 or 5 years after the publication of the novel whether he imagined it would still be around in 25 years, said essentially, I doubt it, because the issues that I wrote about are quickly disappearing. And it's just so bittersweet.
Yeah, I used to reread The Fire Next Time once a year, and I had to stop doing it because I felt so much despair that the questions felt just as relevant. And I think that there's a way in which the sort of continued relevance of the framing, the questions being framed by this book is also, beautiful for the sake of literature, but kind of depressing for the state of the world.
Yes. And it would remain beautiful as literature and provoking, even if the issues changed. For example, we read about debtors' prisons in David Copperfield, and they're still very, very vivid and pressing. And of course, we also see some of that coming back. But I mean, because we move forward for something doesn't make it less effective in the book, and we could only wish. Somebody says, that gives me the chills that Ellison didn't think the same issues would still exist. Invisible Man remains so relevant today in 2021. This is Luna Lynn, one of my favorite novels, Luna says.
I mean, Ellison had a profound sense, abiding sense of hope for the country, not optimism, not a narrow optimism, but a sense of hope that we could fulfill the grand principles that the nation is stood for. And he took quite a bit of grief,
Mm.
particularly in the radical moments of the Black Power movement, Black arts movement of the 60s, from those who saw capitulation in that turn. And I think now readers, even those of us who are progressive minded, even those of us who are radical minded, can understand that, in fact, at least I hope we can, that there is something profoundly radical in the claim and embrace of America and American democracy at the end of the novel. Because for Ellison, it's a desperate and necessary move to say that who is more American than us?
Yeah.
In fact, in 1970, he writes an essay for Time called "What America Would Be Like Without Blacks," an assignment that Time gave him, and the title that Time gave him, and Ellison turns it on its head, and he writes, whatever else the true American is, he or she or they are also somehow Black. So recentering Blackness as essential to identity of the United States. And I think that in this moment, with all the things that we've seen over the last few years, is about as radical as you can get to believe that that's still a possibility. And I think Ellison would have.
That's a beautiful way to end this evening, I think. Thank you. I think it's so hopeful and so poignant. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you both.
audience,
Thank you
for-
all. And thanks to the Hammer and Claudia Bester and Jenny and to the Department of English at UCLA.